always like to start it with a little bit of fun. And there's our little skeleton ballerina romping through the forest. Anyway, on to the content. The functions of the skeleton. Why do we have a skeleton? Well, first and foremost, it supports the body. It acts as a rigid structure that we can kind of hang our organs on. That's why in lab, we start with, after we do the tissues, we start with the skeleton because then we can hang the muscles on that, and then from there we drape the nervous system on there, and we can tuck our other organs in there. So it really is supportive of the whole body. It acts to protect the soft organs. If we think about your bony thorax, your ribs, your sternum, and your vertebral column, as well as the pelvic girdle, we have really tender, squishy organs stuffed in there, and the bones act to protect these inner vital organs from potentially being damaged. It also allows for movement, as we saw in our skeleton ballerina friend just a moment ago. Having the bones meet up with one another, it allows our body to move in all of the different ways that we are in fact able to move. It acts as a storage area for minerals and fats. Minerals, it might make sense to you, but you wouldn't necessarily think of fats. We used to joke, and oh no, I'm not fat. I have a big skeleton. Well, really, in fact, your skeleton does function in storing fat for your body. It also allows for blood cell formation. All of your blood cells are going to be formed within the marrow of the bone. Now, again, I've posted a couple of crash course videos, and in one of them, they talk about the different types of marrow. We'll talk about it in our lectures, but again, it can't hurt to refer to those lectures to supplement what we're talking about. Now, what does the skeleton consist of? Obviously, it's going to be the bones, but also cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. We need these other connective tissues, the cartilage, ligaments, and tendons, to kind of hold everything together. By that I mean hold the bones together, hold the muscles to the bones, and that sort of thing. And the cartilage acts as a shock absorber, if you will, so we're not going to have grinding bone on bone. That would be very painful, and it would break down the bone very quickly, and we don't want that. We can classify bones in a couple of different ways. We mentioned in lab that your skeleton is made up of 206 bones. The adult skeleton, a child skeleton, is made up of many, many more bones than 206. But for an adult skeleton, we're talking about 206 that are going to be divided into two regions, which we mentioned in lab. The axial skeleton, the skull, vertebral column, and rib cage. We call it the axial skeleton because it forms the vertical axis of your body. And the appendicular skeleton, the bones for the upper and lower limbs, and the associated girdles, the points of attachment. This is what we're going to use for locomotion and movement. This is how we're going to be able to move our body. We can also classify bones according to their shape. And some of these are really, really obvious. And I'm going to go through them, but again, it's kind of a Captain Obvious sort of thing. We have a long bone. A long bone is defined as a bone that is longer than it is wide. No kidding. Examples of a long bone might be the femur, the tibia, the humerus. But we also have to think of our phalanges, right? They're not terribly long, but they certainly are longer than they are wide. We have short bones, which are going to be, you got it, short. The bone is about as long as it is wide. An example of a short bone, I probably should have looked this up before I started. An example of a short bone would be a carpal, okay, in a wrist bone. A flat bone, slightly curved and flattened. Your sternum, your ilium, the bones of your skull are all examples of flat bones. Irregular bones, this is a great definition. You're going to love this one. It doesn't fit in any of the above categories. It's not long, it's not short, it's not flat. I feel kind of like Goldilocks, right? It's not long, it's not short, it's not flat. It's just right. It's irregular. Now, a fifth category, again, I add because it's a little bit weird. These are the sesamoid bones. We talked about these in lecture. We talked about these in lab, If you remember your bone list, patella is under the sesamoid category. A sesamoid bone is a bone that's surrounded by connective tissue. It doesn't have that bone-to-bone connection that we're used to. Like if you envision your femur and your tibia and your fibula, there's bone-to-bone. Sesamoid bones lack that. I identify 3 sesamoid bones for you. First is the hyoid. Then we have our sutural bones in the skull. And our favorite, the patella, sutural bones, and the hyoid. Right, so those are our 3 sesamoid bones that we can identify. Now, here we have kind of a nice diagram, a nice overview. Your text has a diagram very much like this. Okay, so we have our long bones. We're using the radius and ulna as an example for that. Short bones, your carpals. Flat bones, the bones of the skull, as I said. Irregular bones, your vertebrae are a great example of irregular bones. The sphenoid is another wonderful example of an irregular bone. Your sesamoid bones, patella, your sutural bone, and again, the hyoid. Now we're going to talk a lot about the anatomy of a long bone. Right? And please notice we're talking about long bones here. Gross anatomy again is not icky ooh, but I can see it with the naked eye. So we're going to look at the long bone through a gross anatomical perspective. We'll also look at it as a microscopic perspective. So when we talk about the gross anatomy, we're talking about the features that we can see on that bone with the naked eye. First, we can talk about the diaphysis. The diaphysis is what makes a long bone long. It's the long portion of it. We call it the long shaft. Contained within the diaphysis is something called the medullary cavity. Medullary or medulla is a word that we have to kind of get a handle on. It's like nucleus. And remember when we first started talking about the nucleus, we said there's lots of different applications of nucleus, but the term itself means center. Similar to medullary. Medulla is deep, the center of a structure. So the medullary cavity is a cavity that we're going to find in the center of the shaft of a long bone. This is where we find yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is a polite way of saying this is where we store fat in our bones, because you remember, one of our functions of the skeletal system was to store fat. We have an epiphysis. Epiphyses, and there's 2 of them, and there are 2 of them because an epiphysis is a bone end, and we have both a proximal and a distal end. This is set up with a compact bone covering. I like to think of this as a sponge candy, right? Inside a sponge candy, you have that sponginess. We would call it in a bone, cancellous bone. And then you have the chocolate covering on the outside, and that's going to be the compact bone. These bone ends form joint surfaces. The joint surfaces are going to be covered with hyaline cartilage. Again, that hyaline cartilage acts as a shock absorber, prevents rubbing and scraping of bone ends on each other. Red bone marrow, is located in the proximal ends. Again, proximal toward the point of attachment. Red bone marrow is where we produce all of our blood cells, both red blood cells and white. And it can be a little misleading because it says red bone marrow, therefore it's got to be red blood cells. Well, certainly it's going to be the red blood cells, but also we can't forget we're going to have our white blood cells formed there, because we call it red because it's in contrast to yellow, or the lipid tissue, that yellow fat that we identified in the subcutaneous layers. Here's a diagram, and it shows us what we mean by spongy bone. If we look at the proximal end of our femur, you see that it looks kind of spongy, right? There's bone, but there's also pockets of emptiness. That would be filled with red marrow if this was a live bone. We look at our diaphysis, or the shaft. We see our medullary cavity, which is an empty space that is filled with that yellow material, which is the yellow marrow or the adipose tissue. This is maybe a better diagram. Again, side by side on the left, it's a living bone, so it's going to be filled with both the adipose tissue and the bone marrow, right? So we have the red and the yellow. And on the right, it's dried, so you're seeing the empty spaces of the spongy or cancellous bone. Next, we have the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate. I apologize in advance. I'm fascinated by the epiphyseal plate and the epiphyseal line because it's really intriguing to me. This is why, actually, this epiphyseal plate is why young children have so many more bones than adults. Let me explain. This is site of bone elongation. This is how a long bone, because remember, we're talking long bones here. This is how a long bone is going to get longer. This is how someone will get taller. Growth at the epiphyseal plate. It consists of hyaline cartilage. So because there's this pad of hyaline cartilage, and I have x-rays to show you in a moment, because we have this pad of hyaline cartilage, the femur is broken up into technically in a child 3 bones because it's not one whole bony piece that we see in an adult. Next, we have the epiphyseal line. This is the remnant of the epiphyseal plate. This is what's left over of the epiphyseal plate once that cartilage has become ossified. Ossified is a super fancy word that simply means it's turned to bone. So when we look at a bone, when we look at somebody's x-rays, we can determine if this individual can continue to grow, if the epiphyseal plate is in place, or if the person has reached skeletal maturity. They cannot grow any further because that cartilaginous plate, the epiphyseal plate, has become bony. It has become ossified. This is considered to be the dividing line between the shaft and the bone ends, the diaphysis and the epiphyses. And again, you can see the epiphyseal disc in this diagram. Epiphyseal disc is a fancy word for that epiphyseal line. This is a bone that has become fully ossified. This would be in an adult. Here we have a couple of x-rays. On the left, we have the femur and the tibia. On the right, we have the hand. Let's look on the left side. Let's concentrate on that femur and tibia. We have arrows here, and you'll notice that the arrow is pointing at kind of a dark line, what typically shows us where there is no bone. But we have the end of the shaft, the bottom end of the shaft of the femur, and then the condyles of the femur. And we see the same with the tibia. So that gap, what looks like a gap, is actually the hyaline cartilage. So that's why we would say that there's more bones than just one. We look at the hand, we can see the same thing with our metacarpals and our phalanges. If you look closely, you're going to see that at the ends, there's little space, there's a gap. That doesn't mean that there's a break there, it means that that is where the epiphyseal plate is located. Now, again, on the left we have the femur and the tibia, on the right we have the hand, and you can see the epiphyseal line. We no longer have a gap there, but we have kind of a darker white, if you will, where that plate has become ossified. So this individual still has the ability to grow, right? Their bones can still elongate because the epiphyseal plate is in place. This individual has reached skeletal maturity. This individual can no longer grow because that plate has become bone. The only way somebody can grow is if that cartilaginous plate is in place. Next, we'll talk about the